Hello, Jess. Welcome to A Bit Lit. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. So could you start by maybe telling us a bit about yourself?
Yes, I am a PhD candidate at the University of Alabama in the Hudson Strode program for Renaissance Studies here in beautiful Tuscaloosa, Alabama, where we survive tornadoes. We're fine.
Wow.
I work, yes, yeah, Easter Sunday tornadoes, not anyone's favorite day ever.
Yeah, it adds a whole
scary
element of drama to the lockdown, which is already quite traumatic. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, but we got through it. We're okay.
Excellent.
I work on Shakespeare in times of unrest, pretty broadly defined. My interest in that stemmed out of my master's work, which I did in Stanton, Virginia, where you have spent some time.
Yes, indeed.
And that Virginia is sort of a hotbed for Civil War activity, United States Civil War activity. Most of the battles of the Civil War were fought in Virginia. And it has always been my favorite war, which is a weird thing to say, but I have loved the Civil War since I was a child. And so I thought, are there ways that I can fit these two things I love, the Civil War and Shakespeare, together and do something thesis-y with that? And so I did, and I ended up writing about performances of Shakespeare in Richmond, Virginia, which is the capital of Virginia, but was also the capital of the Confederacy for most of the Civil War, and I was interested in seeing what they were doing there, how they were using Shakespeare, to what effect. The most popular play of all plays, not just Shakespeare, but of any play in Richmond during the Civil War, was Macbeth, followed not quite so closely by Richard III, which is pretty interesting. Yeah. And as the war continued, Macbeth's popularity went down and Richard's went up, which is also a really interesting trajectory. So when I got to the dissertation level, I thought, okay, well, let's sort of, I've done this work, so let's see how we can build that into something dissertation-y. And the project has undergone several revisions, and it's getting there. I'm like maybe 5/8 of the way through.
Exciting. So past the halfway mark.
Yes,
Congratulations.
I have drafted 2 of my 4 chapters, and we'll start drafting chapter 3 at the end of the month.
Fabulous. Yeah.
So it's taking shape, and it thinks about Shakespeare from 1601 through almost the end of the 19th century. So it's big. Wow. It's a big project, and it takes place in different geographical places as well. I start in London and I end in British India, and in the middle I spend some time in America, which is where I'm at right now, both physically and in my research. I'm working
Wonderful.
on the early days of the American Republic, post-revolution, but pre-Civil War, sort of in that turn of the century, early 19th century area, which Wonderful. Is not a time period that I know much about in American history. So I'm having to learn some things, which, how dare I learn why am I complaining about that?
Well, but it sounds like it's quite I'm someone who wrote my PhD thesis on an extremely specific point in time and place, early modern England, basically within Shakespeare's career. So I can really understand how having to learn things related to such a variety of time periods and such a variety of spaces, that is a significant, gift and challenge, I imagine. And there's something really lovely about, from what you've said, I was drawn to the American Shakespeare Center in Stanton, Virginia, and that's why I spent so much time there. And it sounds as if for you, the fact that it's a place for Shakespeare and the fact that it's a place so rich with history of the Civil War sort of came together in a beautiful site-specific confluence that then set up everything that followed.
It really did, yeah.
Yeah, and so how...
Yeah, well, and Stanton is just maybe not quite 2 hours north of Richmond. So I was able to go down there and spend some time doing research in Richmond, in the Library of Virginia, looking at documents. It was great.
Fantastic. So and so what was the sort of spur that drew you from looking at this very specific time and place to looking at such an interesting range of times and spaces? Is it because does Shakespeare, you talked about Shakespeare and you talked about Unrest, and is there a way that the two are in conversation with each other, these difficult times and Shakespeare sort of in a similar way across all these spaces?
Well, so it originally I conceived of the project as Shakespeare in times of military unrest, not quite war, but so my first chapter starts with the Essex Rebellion, and that chapter is a hot mess. Oh my gosh, it's so bad right now, but it's gonna be better. Which is not, you know, it was a military-ish operation. You know, the whole thing lasted a day.
Oh, and sorry,
maybe.
for anyone who's listening to this who doesn't know about the Essex Rebellion, could you explain briefly what that is?
Yes, I could. I would love to. So February 7th, 1601, the second Earl of Essex, Robert Devereux, some of his friends commissioned a performance at the Globe that may have been Shakespeare's Richard III, probably was, but could maybe have been a different play about Richard III and Henry whichever. Sorry, Richard II.
Right.
Richard II.
Yes, I was thinking, oh my gosh, I didn't know it was Richard III.
Yes, no,
yeah,
Richard II.
Yeah, and Henry
Richard II.
Yeah,
and Henry IV. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was probably Shakespeare's play, but it might have been a different play that is now lost to us. And so there's a long sort of critical history. Historians tend to think it was the lost play, where literary scholars tend to think it was Shakespeare's play.
Because they like to find Shakespeare in places.
Yeah, right? Like, I think it doesn't matter what the identity of the play was. The important thing is that Shakespeare scholars have co-opted this history to sort of deploy an image of Shakespeare as a political actor, which is pretty interesting. And I don't have much more argument to say about that right now, because again, that chapter is a mess.
But it's part of the process, right? Working out.
Yes. Yeah. So I'm trying to, so that's where it starts. And then chapter 2, which I have not written yet or researched very much at all, this is the summer project, thinks about Shakespeare during the English Civil War. So I've got 2 sort of very 17th century Shakespeare England chapters that are thinking about Shakespeare's lifetime and then his sort of immediate afterlife. How were people thinking about and using Shakespeare during of uncertainty and unrest and uprest, and how did Shakespeare come out the other side poised to be England's national poet? And then we have this big gap of time, so moving from the 1660s into 1800 across the ocean, and then from there into 1850s, 1870s, British India, and the later chapters I'm entirely interested in literary adaptation and appropriation. I don't care about performance, which is a polarizing thing to say. And not, I don't care about performance, but what I'm most interested is how bits and pieces of Shakespeare get taken out of context, mostly into novels and like newspapers sort of writing about what's going on. So the British India chapter focuses on mutiny, which took place 1857-58 and was a revolt by the Bengal army against British governments, and then this was as I understand it, the sort of event that brought India under Crown rule. It had not yet been totally under Crown rule, and now it was. And there's a lot of writing that happens in British periodicals at home in England, and Dublin and elsewhere, Edinburgh, that pull pieces of Shakespeare into talking about the events of the mutiny. And there's one incident in particular that's so fascinating, because you know, you might think, all right, well, if I'm a newspaper journalist and I'm writing about this really upsetting military coup across the world, and I want to use Shakespeare to talk about this, I might talk about, you know, Macbeth or Hamlet or, you know, a tragedy, right? That makes sense. But what they end up using a lot are the comedies. There's a lot of Twelfth Night. There's a lot of Measure for Measure. I mean, the tragedies show up too, but the comedies are really interesting, and they take things weirdly out of context. There's this great moment in a newspaper where they're talking about a specific incident, a massacre during the mutiny, in which a lot of women, English women, white women, and children were killed sort of indiscriminately by the big baddie of the Bengal army, whose name was Nina Sahib. And they're talking about, the author of this article is talking about how not even the poet Shakespeare could have up a villain as two-faced as Nina Sahib. Not even the wicked caitiff Lord Angelo, when Shakespeare pulls the curtain back and reveals the duplicity, not even that comes close to this guy. Which, of all of the villains in Shakespeare to choose from, Angelo?
Yeah, that's fascinating. And Angelo, who's a villain in relation to duplicity and sexual misbehavior and coercion, and that seems a completely different realm. That's fascinating.
Right, not Richard III, who actually kills children, not Iago, who is like the two-faced Janus of Shakespeare. So it's very interesting the way that Shakespeare gets pulled into the reporting on the mutiny.
That's fascinating.
And then so most of my work in these later two chapters focuses on novels about the area or the time period or the event or whatever, that uses Shakespeare as paratext for the novels, chapter epigraphs, or little like references within from the characters. That's what I'm really interested in, is how Shakespeare gets used to sort of craft narratives of these other times and places by these white authors.
That's fascinating. So there's sort of a sense that in drawing on Shakespeare, Shakespeare becomes a sort of common cultural vocabulary almost that people can engage with. So as you said, in the construction of a baddie, it's to reach for a Shakespearean character that represents that. But at the same time, there are incongruities in how that's being played with and our expectations. Wow, that sounds really fascinating. And are you tempted to, I know this is a whole other question, but I'm just feeling like Shakespeare in difficult times, we're now in quite a dramatically difficult time. Does that fit into your thinking at all? Does it make you tempted to write a present tense thesis?
So I had long planned from sort of the inception of this project. I was like, okay, I'm gonna have a coda, an epilogue, something that's gonna deal with Brexit.
Right.
And then this happened. And then I accidentally wrote 1,000 words about thinking with and teaching and reading Shakespeare during this. And this was...
Give us a glimpse of what you're saying.
So around the middle of March, when the pandemic in this country really started to ramp up, it's been moving this way. The University of Alabama took their sweet time and then said, okay, when we come back from spring break, we're not actually coming back from spring break. And a couple days, I think right before that, the World Health Organization had officially classified this as a pandemic. And then a few days after that, the Shakespeare Association of America canceled their annual meeting.
Right, which we should be at right now.
Right, yeah, I should be on a plane or driving to get on my plane.
Same.
It's upsetting. It's all upsetting. But so in the midst of this sort of like 10-day period where I was waiting for all of the people who directly affect my life to announce that we were closing things and not going places, and I was trying to work on my dissertation and couldn't because of the ever-present fear and the ever-looming uncertainty. And sort of the question at the root of my entire project is, why do people turn to Shakespeare in times of uncertainty?
That's such a good question.
And I don't know that I have an answer for all people, because that's not a thing, right? Shakespeare is not universal as much as some people would like him to be. But I was able to answer it for myself, which is that Shakespeare's endurance from his lifetime to now provides me with some comfort that the world has always been and will continue to be, and has gone through worse things and other things and things that are just as bad or not as bad or upsetting in different ways. And Shakespeare for me is a touchstone to sort of hang my hat on, that, well, this has survived, and if this can survive, which is, you know, it's a premium, it's paper, it's not super durable. I'm more durable than paper. So if Shakespeare can survive, so can I.
Yeah, that's beautiful, particularly as I suppose plays themselves are such ephemeral things. So even for these plays to become paper, or having been paper turned into performance, turned back into paper, is pretty startling that it lasted.
Right, and you can never capture a performance, really. I mean, even when you film a thing, it's not the same as being there. So that kind of, it's all ephemeral, but I am corporal and I will survive this. So I started thinking about what I was doing in these moments of uncertainty, and how I was thinking about Shakespeare, and what I was thinking about my work, and how this was going to get me through. And really, it hinges on Much Ado About Nothing, which is, let me back up and explain. So in the fall, if we come back and we actually teach, which I think we will, I don't know that we will do it in person, but I will teach in the fall. I am planning to teach Much Ado About Nothing in my Brit Lit survey. For the first time. I haven't taught this play ever before, but the reason I want to do it is because of the Public Theater's production from last summer that was filmed by PBS and it has been made available with starring Danielle Brooks. It's the all-Black production at the Public Theater in New York that was so good. It was so good. It blew my mind. It made me see the play in a whole new way, which
I wish I'd seen it.
It's so good. I think it is definitely still streaming right now, but I'm not sure if it's streaming outside of the US.
Okay, well, if people watching this in the US while it's shortly after it's been put on YouTube, please find that production and watch it.
Yes, yeah, it's so good. But what I think this production does better than the play itself does on the page is it infects the entire world of the play with the specter of war. They come in from at the top of the play when the men come back from war, whatever, they're coming back from a Black Lives Matter protest, and they come in with their signs and they're marching in, and it's very regimented and it's very military. And then at the end, right, when they're having their dance before they all run off to get married, it's interrupted by sirens and their sort of troop leader, regiment leader, calling them back to order, and they fall in and they march out. And it haunts the whole play, and it's incredibly moving. And I think this is going to sound, I mean, it's not, well, it made Shakespeare relevant in a way that I think will be very teachable and very accessible to my students here in Tuscaloosa, in the South, in 2020, and opens doors in new ways, right? I don't subscribe to the idea that Shakespeare, that you have to have some kind of specialized knowledge to understand Shakespeare. I think Shakespeare is for everyone. You may not like him, and that's fine, but I don't, the idea that we need to gatekeep Shakespeare, that you have to have some kind of, you know, code word to get in, and then like then you'll understand, I think that's nonsense. I do think that well, whatever. I'm gonna redirect. So I have found in time here at the University of Alabama that my students are open to Shakespeare, but have, you know, the preconceived notions. Most of them have read Romeo and Juliet in high school and liked it or didn't, and then come in with that mindset. And Much Ado is, it engages with ideas about gender that I really am trying to bring into my survey as a whole, right? It is the Brit Lit survey. It's super white, it's super male. And I've been trying to interrogate that as much as I can, like many other people all over the Western world at this moment. And I think this production, this specific production of Much Ado, is also going to open up conversations about race and conversations about politics, conversations about geography that are harder to have when you have students who are mostly non-majors, who are mostly there to just check a box to say, yes, I did my lit requirement, and to get into why people like this stuff and why it matters and why it's relevant, you know, and what we can do with it and how we can make it speak to our own lives and why we might want it to speak to our own lives. And that, I think, is the key, is trying to get whoever, students, people, professors, colleagues, me, you, whoever, trying to get people to understand why they might want this dead white man to speak to their lives.
Wonderful. And so, I mean, on that note, I wonder if we could segue from that into your podcast, because I believe you have a podcast that also relates to Shakespeare and Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Everyone in some way. Could you tell me a bit about that?
Yeah, so I'm a co-host of the Hurly Burly Shakespeare Show. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts. And we're in our third year. We're just wrapping up our third season. And we're going to take a longer break than we have because of, you know, the world. And I have a dissertation to finish and I have to like go on the job market. So we'll come back for season 4, but we're just not quite sure when. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. So my co-host Aubrey Whitlock is a friend from my master's days. She is also at the American Shakespeare Center. She's in the education department there. And so she comes to Shakespeare from a background as a high school English teacher, language arts in California. Then she came and she did her master's work with us. She is a theater practitioner. She acts, she directs, she does it all. I am a scholar and I want nothing to do with performance or practitioner at any time. I have left the stage in my past. That is not for me. So we come to Shakespeare from like basically the either end of the spectrum of people who use and work with Shakespeare. And we thought, well, okay, you know, let's do this. And let's do it in a way that makes sense for us. So if you think about like a college course, you know, you're going to have like Intro to Shakespeare 101 and then maybe Intermediate Shakespeare 201 and so on. So we've structured our episodes on 101, 201, and 301 levels. So every play at the 101 level gets, you know, you're gonna have a summary, and you're gonna have like, here's some textual history, and here's some stuff to look out for if you're gonna go see it. And we play a game, and we gossip about, you know, just what's going on in the land of Shakespeare. And it's a pretty broad entry point. It's not designed to, like, you can't listen to this podcast and not read the play for school, because we're not going to give you all of that. But it'll probably kickstart some thoughts for you. We also swear a lot.
Right, so not child friendly.
A lot. No. It's maybe high school and above. It's definitely PG-13 and above. At the 201 level, we try to go narrow and deep on like maybe 2 specific topics relating to the play. So I think for our Romeo and Juliet 201 episode, I was really interested in, like, okay, the poison. Like, is that at all historically accurate? Like, is that scientifically accurate? What could this have been? It was Shakespeare making stuff up, and we laser focused on that. Yeah. And then at the 301 level, we talk about like one thing. So for our Richard III 301, we had a guest, Lindsay Snyder, Dr. Lindsay Snyder, who works with Faction of Fools Theater Company in Washington, D.C., which is primarily a company made up of deaf actors. And sometimes it's deaf and hearing mixed. And she was telling us about a production that she had directed with a mixed, I think it was a 5-hand cast, but it was mixed deaf and hearing. And the Richard was deaf, and so had signed his whole role was signed. And she was, you know, how do you stage these things, and how do we stage these moments when you have to hold a sword, but also you have to sign? And yeah, so we're really thinking about like all kinds of things. And now we've completed the canon of Shakespeare plays. Yeah, and we've moved on to some other fun and it's mostly like, what crazy non-Shakespeare play did Jess read that she wants to take? I'm making Aubrey read a lot of plays.
That sounds like a treat.
So we've done... it's really fun for me. You know, we started with like the obvious heavy hitters: Revenger's Tragedy, Spanish Tragedy, Duchess of Malfi, Faustus, so on and so forth. But we've also done some weird plays. We just did Richard Broom's Jovial Crew, which is late. It's 1642, and no one's heard of it. And it's bonkers. It's a bonkers play, and I love it. I love it so much.
Oh yeah, I'd love to ask you more about those niche early modern plays and about The Poison and what you discovered about it, but I think sadly we're at the point of the conversation where I have to start drawing it to a close. So we're asking everyone to finish off by saying, what is literature to you? And I feel you've hinted at it a bit already. I know it's a gigantic question, but you've hinted at it in your answer to what Shakespeare is to you, maybe. So is that sort of what your answer would be for what is literature to you as well? Is it sort of as a kind of cultural touchstone?
Yes.
Yes, you can. Yeah.
Yeah. Whatever I already said. That's what I think literature is.
Well, I thought what you were saying that was really poignant was about how literature, or at least Shakespeare, is something that endures. And so when there's change and unrest and disturbance and fear, it's sort of something that is not ephemeral. And would you say that summed it up?
I would say that sounds very erudite, and I agree with the thing that you just said that I said.
Wonderful.
Yeah, I think that checks.
Fabulous. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me today. It's been lovely to hear all about the many exciting things you're thinking about, and I look forward to reading your coda on what Shakespeare means now.
Thank you.
Thank you.